It was a regular morning at the airport, but for General Tamara Johnson, nothing about this flight would be ordinary. She was dressed in her uniform, her posture sharp and confident, an embodiment of the strength and resilience that had carried her through years of military service. She'd earned her place, had fought hard for every step she'd taken, and today she was looking forward to a well-deserved break. But what happened as she made her way toward the boarding gate would change everything. As she approached the counter, a man in a suit, with an air of superiority, glanced up at her, and the moment their eyes met, something shifted. He wasn't just a flight attendant or a ground staff member. This was someone who seemed to carry an unshakable sense of entitlement, the kind of person who believed his status and position allowed him to treat others as less than. But he didn't know who he was dealing with. When the man coolly informed General Johnson that there were no more seats in first class, her instinct was to ask about upgrades or alternative solutions. But as she listened, the tone of his voice became increasingly dismissive. There was something in his words that wasn't just about the seating. It was about his attempt to undermine her, to make her feel smaller, less important. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. This was about respect, dignity, and fairness. The general could feel it. What happened next is something that no one expected. Tamara, instead of backing down, decided to challenge the situation head-on. She wasn't just going to let this man walk away thinking he had the power to humiliate her or anyone else. She had faced far greater challenges than this in her life, tougher, more dangerous, and far more consequential. But none of those had ever tested her patience or resolve quite like this. In the blink of an eye, the situation escalated. The once confident man began to feel a shift in the atmosphere as General Johnson remained calm but unyielding. She was a leader, a woman who had learned the art of strategy, the power of silence, and the quiet force of calculated moves. But today, she wasn't going to let the injustice slide. As the tension built in the air, passengers in the line started to notice. Some whispered, others stared. It was clear that something more than just a seating mix-up was taking place. In that moment, the flight attendant realized his mistake, but it was too late. General Johnson wasn't about to let him off easily. The twist? She wasn't alone. As the confrontation continued, a surprising ally stepped forward. This wasn't just a case of a powerful woman standing up for herself. It became a story of unity, where strength, intelligence, and sheer willpower collided. But this was only the beginning. The man who thought he could humiliate a black general was about to face consequences that would leave him stunned, humbled, and perhaps forever changed. What happened next was something few could have anticipated. What started as a simple request for a seat quickly spiraled into a test of character, integrity, and power. And with every word spoken, the stakes got higher. The once smug man was about to learn that his actions had consequences that went far beyond what he could ever imagine. But what did General Johnson do next? What was her plan to make sure he paid for his arrogance? The answers will shock you, and the consequences will leave you thinking long after the story ends. Stay tuned to find out how one woman's instant revenge turned an unjust situation into a lesson the man would never forget. As the general stood there, her eyes locked onto the man in front of her, she couldn't help but replay the countless times she had faced similar situations in her life. It was never easy being a woman in a field dominated by men, and it was even harder being a black woman in a place where every small victory felt like it came with 1,000 whispers. But Tamara had learned long ago not to let these obstacles define her. They only made her stronger. She had spent years earning respect, climbing through the ranks, enduring the ridicule and the doubts, all to prove that she was capable, that she belonged. And now here she was, standing in front of a man who had no idea just how much he had underestimated her. Her military background had taught her the importance of discipline, control, and strategy. The general had faced far more intimidating and dangerous adversaries than this man, but what he lacked in physical danger, he made up for in arrogance. He didn't see her as a force to be reckoned with. To him, she was just another woman, another black person trying to take up space where it wasn't meant to be. And that thought, that small, ignorant assumption, sparked something in Tamara, a fire she wasn't prepared to ignore. She had learned the hard way that silence was a weapon in its own right. So, as the man continued to dismiss her politely but firmly, she didn't immediately react. Instead, she took a slow, steady breath, letting the weight of his words sink in. She had seen this attitude before, the way people tried to diminish her, tried to pretend like her achievements didn't mean anything. But they did, and they always would. He glanced at her again, this time a bit more impatient. He had to get the rest of the passengers boarded. He was trying to rush her through the process, treating her like just another number in a sea of travelers. She was an inconvenience, a hurdle to his perfect day. But Tamara wasn't about to let him forget who she was. "Is there any way we could upgrade or find another solution?" she asked, her voice calm, yet with an undertone of firmness that he didn't catch. She wasn't being aggressive, she was simply stating her case. The man hesitated for a moment, his face twisting as though he were trying to decide whether he should humor her or shut her down completely. Finally, he let out a little sigh and shook his head, as if to dismiss the thought altogether. "I'm afraid we're fully booked, ma'am," he said, eyes never meeting hers directly. "No seats in first class. I can offer you a seat in coach." It was the way he said it that made Tamara's blood boil. It wasn't the offer itself. It was the implication that it didn't matter who she was, that she was no different from anyone else. He had written her off. But it wasn't just that. There was a certain condescension in his tone, as if he were doing her a favor by even talking to her. "I don't think you understand," Tamara said quietly, leaning forward just slightly. The air around them seemed to cool, as if the tension had thickened and now everyone in the vicinity could feel it. "I've worked very hard for everything I have. My rank, my respect, my achievements. I don't take kindly to being treated this way." The man's eyes widened, but he quickly masked his surprise with a forced smile. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am. I can't do anything more." But Tamara was having none of it. Her instincts told her that this was more than just a seat on a plane. It was a test. A test of who she was, of how she would handle being pushed down, of how far this man was willing to go to prove he was in control. But it wasn't about proving something to him. It was about proving something to herself. The crowd around them started to take notice, murmurs spreading through the line as people began to realize something unusual was unfolding. Some passengers, unsure of what was happening, began to inch closer, straining to catch the next words exchanged. Others pulled out their phones, thinking this might be the start of a scene they wouldn't want to miss. But Tamara wasn't here to perform for an audience. This was personal. With a calmness that belied the storm brewing inside her, she raised her hand, signaling for him to stop talking. She knew she had to stay composed. Any move she made had to be calculated, intentional. She couldn't afford to lose control now, not when everything was on the line. "I don't care if you're just doing your job," she said, her voice now low and steady, a dangerous calm in her tone. "Your job is not just about following orders. It's about treating people with respect. It's about doing what's right. And I won't allow you to disrespect me or anyone else just because you think you can." The man opened his mouth to respond, but the words faltered as he realized the gravity of the situation. He wasn't just dealing with a frustrated passenger. He was dealing with someone who wasn't going to back down. He was dealing with a leader, a person who had fought for everything she had, and he hadn't even noticed. The eyes of the passengers seemed to be on him now, watching his every move. Some of them, the ones who had been quiet observers, were beginning to shift their attention toward the counter, some subtly aligning themselves with Tamara's unspoken stance. She was no longer just one person. She was now an embodiment of something larger, something that resonated with everyone who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or disrespected. At that moment, the flight attendant's smirk began to fade. He shuffled his papers, then checked the computer screen in front of him. He seemed to be growing more nervous, the weight of the situation finally catching up with him. But still, he clung to his dismissive attitude. He didn't know who he was. "I'll have to ask for a manager," he said finally, Though the words were less confident than they had been moments before, it was as if he hoped the manager would bail him out, put an end to this uncomfortable situation. Tamara nodded slowly, her face unwavering. "Please do," she said simply. Dealing with, or at least he didn't think he did. But what the man didn't know was that the manager he was about to summon was already well aware of who General Johnson was. In fact, she had made quite an impression the last time she had flown this airline, though the general had no idea her reputation would come into play today. As the minutes stretched on, the atmosphere thickened. Every tick of the clock felt like a drumbeat, each second adding more weight to the confrontation. What would the manager say? Would he side with the arrogant flight attendant, or would he do what was right? The tension hung in the air, making it clear that whatever happened next would not only change the course of Tamara's day, it might just change the way this airline operated forever. As the minutes ticked by, Tamara stood her ground, her posture as unyielding as a stone, her eyes never leaving the flight attendant's face. She could feel the quiet buzz of anticipation around her, a low hum of whispered conversations and shifting bodies. People were watching, and the weight of their gazes only added to the rising tension. She had no intention of letting this man's behavior slide, but the question remained: how far was she willing to push? How far could she go before it escalated beyond words? The flight attendant, now visibly sweating, turned to walk away, and with a sigh disappeared into the back office. Tamara's mind was racing. She had lived through so many moments where people had tried to undermine her, but this was different. This wasn't just about the flight. This was about dignity, respect, and equality. This was about the countless times she had been told she didn't belong, or that she had to work twice as hard just to prove she was worthy. No, not today. She was done with being silent in the face of injustice. Around her, passengers shifted uneasily, unsure of where to look, as if they were all waiting for the next move. Some glanced nervously at one another, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Others, particularly a few older men, looked away, unwilling to get involved. But then, a woman with a baby in a stroller approached Tamara. She gave her a silent nod, as if to say, "I see you. I understand, The small gesture wasn't much, but to Tamara, it was everything. It reminded her that, even in the midst of adversity, there were people who understood, people who had experienced similar struggles. This wasn't just her fight. It was a fight for anyone who had ever been underestimated or dismissed simply because of the way they looked or the way they carried themselves. And now, more than ever, the stakes were personal. A few moments later, the flight attendant returned, but he was no longer alone. The manager, a tall man in his late 40s with a neatly trimmed beard and a crisp uniform, followed closely behind him. The man's expression was unreadable, but Tamara could sense that he was already sizing her up. He wasn't just about to handle a seating issue. He was about to deal with something far more complicated. "Ma'am," the manager said, his voice smooth but firm. "I understand there's been a bit of confusion here. Let's see if we can resolve this quickly." Tamara didn't move. She didn't need to. She had been patient long enough. The manager glanced at the flight attendant, who quickly went over the details of the situation. From what Tamara could gather, he was trying to paint her as the unreasonable one. He mentioned how she had insisted on first-class seating, how she'd been uncooperative when offered an alternative. His words were carefully chosen, meant to make her sound difficult. But Tamara wasn't fooled. She had seen this tactic before, people trying to twist the narrative to make themselves seem like the victim. The manager turned back to her. "I apologize for the confusion, ma'am. However, I do need to clarify something. Our policy is clear. We cannot offer first-class upgrades unless there is availability." Tamara's gaze didn't waver. "I understand your policy," she said, her voice low but sharp. "But I'm not asking for an upgrade. I'm asking for respect. I'm asking to be treated the same as everyone else. Your colleague chose to dismiss me before even considering the facts, and that is not acceptable." The manager blinked, seemingly taken aback by the directness of her response. For a moment, he seemed uncertain, as if he were unsure how to handle the situation. The flight attendant, however, stood there, arms crossed, avoiding eye contact with anyone. It was clear he wasn't interested in finding a solution. He was more concerned with protecting his ego than doing the right thing. "Look," Tamara continued, her tone softening slightly but still filled with conviction. "This isn't just about a seat. It's about the way I've been treated. I've earned my place here, in this airport, in this country, in this uniform, and I'm not going to let anyone try to erase that." The manager opened his mouth, but before he could respond, a young man, someone who had been standing in the line behind her, spoke up. His voice was quiet, but there was a strength in it that caught everyone's attention. "I don't know what's going on here," he said, "but I saw everything. And what I saw was the guy at the counter being rude to her for no reason. That's not right. I've been traveling for years, and I've never seen anyone treated like that." His words hung in the air, sharp and honest. Tamara turned to face him, surprised. She hadn't expected anyone to speak up, let alone a stranger who seemed to understand the situation so clearly. The manager's eyes flicked between the young man and Tamara, but he said nothing. The silence between them grew thick with tension. The flight attendant, sensing his position slipping, stepped forward awkwardly. "I wasn't being rude," he muttered, almost defensively. "I just followed the rules." "Rules are made to be followed, yes," Tamara said, "but they're also made to be challenged when they're unjust. And when people use those rules to demean others, it's no longer about the rules. It's about power, control, and who gets to decide what's fair." The manager nodded slowly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but unwilling to openly challenge his employee. His gaze shifted to the flight attendant, and then back to Tamara, as though he were trying to read the situation, trying to figure out how to end this without causing further conflict. But it wasn't that simple. This wasn't just about an airline policy or a simple seating arrangement. It was about a deeper issue. An issue that extended far beyond the boundaries of the airport. It was about the systemic nature of racism, about the way society had, for centuries, found ways to diminish and belittle those who were deemed other. Tamara had been fighting against this for her entire life, and now, standing in the middle of the airport terminal, it felt like the battle had come to her doorstep. The young man who had spoken up earlier was still standing nearby, his eyes locked onto the scene unfolding before him. He had been listening intently, taking in every word, every interaction. He had seen how the flight attendant had treated Tamara, and he knew what that looked like, a familiar, oppressive behavior that had plagued too many people for far too long. But he wasn't just a passive observer. He was someone who had lived with that same weight on his shoulders, someone who knew how easy it was to let things slide, to look away when injustice reared its ugly head. But today he had chosen not to. The tension was mounting, and the air felt thick with the unspoken words that were hanging between them. The manager opened his mouth again, but before he could say anything, another voice cut through the silence. A woman from the back of the line, a mother who had been quietly watching the interaction, stepped forward. Her voice was soft, but there was a steel-like resolve in it that demanded attention. "I've been in this situation before," she said, "and I know exactly what's going on here. It's not just about the seat. It's about making someone feel less than. It's about sending a message that says, 'You don't matter.' And I'm sick of it." Now, there were more people speaking up. More people were starting to gather around. The atmosphere was shifting, the tide was turning. The flight attendant was no longer just facing Tamara. He was facing a growing crowd of people who were tired of being silent, tired of watching injustice happen without doing anything about it. And that, in itself, was a power Tamara had never imagined when she first stepped up to that counter. But now it was clear, this wasn't just her fight anymore. This was everyone's fight, and no matter how the airline tried to contain it, this was a moment that was going to leave a mark. What would happen next? Would the flight attendant admit to his mistake, or would he double down, risking even further humiliation? Would the manager do what was right, or would he hide behind his policies, afraid to make a stand? The tension was palpable, And the crowd continued to wait, each person holding their breath, wondering how this would all unfold. The atmosphere in the airport terminal had shifted. It was no longer just about a seating mix-up, it was about something much larger. The tension in the air was so thick, you could almost feel it pressing against your chest. Tamara stood firm, her eyes locked on the flight attendant, who now seemed a little smaller, a little less confident than he had been moments ago. The manager, too, was growing visibly uncomfortable. His eyes darted between the growing crowd of passengers and the quiet but unyielding figure standing before him. The murmurs had turned into whispers, and some passengers were even taking out their phones, unsure whether they were witnessing a confrontation or a moment of truth. There was no turning back. If she backed down, it would send a message that this kind of behavior could continue unchecked, that disrespect would go unchallenged. But she wasn't backing down. The flight attendant shifted on his feet, clearly rattled by the sudden shift in power. He glanced nervously at the manager, who still hadn't made a move to resolve the situation. The manager, in turn, appeared to be stuck, caught between doing what was right and maintaining his own position. He was a man of authority, no doubt, but in this moment he seemed more like a puppet, struggling to decide whose strings he was going to follow. The flight attendant's actions were now under scrutiny, and the manager was beginning to realize that his own decisions were about to be weighed against the growing support Tamara had from the passengers around her. A few seconds passed, but it felt like hours. Time seemed to stretch as the tension built and the crowd held its breath. Tamara's heart was pounding, but she didn't let her nerves show. She had been in worse situations, had faced down enemies on the battlefield, had dealt with pressures that would break most people. But none of that had prepared her for this. None of it had prepared her for the quiet cruelty of someone who thought they could use their small amount of power to belittle another person. She was ready to fight, but this was a different kind of battle. As the manager finally opened his mouth to speak, Tamara could sense the hesitation in his voice. It was like he was testing the waters, trying to see just how far he could go before the situation slipped out of his control. "Ma'am," he began slowly, "I understand your frustration. I do. But you must understand that our policies are in place for a reason." Tamara's eyes narrowed slightly. She had heard it all before, the justification, the excuses, the way people clung to rules as if they were the ultimate shield against accountability. But she wasn't here to hear about policies. She was here to be heard, to make sure that what had happened to her didn't happen to anyone else. "I don't need a lesson in policies," she said, her voice steady, but with an edge of finality. "What I need is for someone to take responsibility for what's happened, for the way I've been treated. That's what matters here." A pregnant silence filled the space between them. The flight attendant shifted again, clearly uncomfortable. The passengers were watching him now, waiting for him to respond, waiting for the manager to step in and say something that would make this right. But the longer this dragged on, the more Tamara realized this wasn't just about her. This was a test of character, of what kind of people these others were. Would they continue to stand idly by, or would they speak up too? She glanced over at the young man who had spoken earlier, the one who had stood up for her when no one else had. He was watching closely, and his face showed signs of frustration, but also a quiet sense of hope. This wasn't just a fight between her and the airline anymore. It was a stand that could change things for everyone who had ever been ignored or dismissed. The manager's mouth opened again, but no words came out. He looked at the flight attendant, then back at Tamara. The longer he hesitated, the more the situation slipped away from him. She could see it in his eyes, the realization that he wasn't just facing one woman standing her ground. He was facing a room full of people who were watching closely, waiting to see if he would do the right thing. In that moment, the crowd's energy shifted again. A few more voices joined the conversation, not in angry protests, but in firm, steady tones, speaking out in support of Tamara. "She's right," an older woman said quietly. "It's not about the seat, it's about respect." "You can't let him get away with this," a man added, his voice clear, cutting through the tension. The manager's face began to flush, his eyes darting from one person to another as the reality of the situation settled in. There was no escaping the truth now. It was no longer just Tamara versus the flight attendant. It was the system that had allowed this behavior to continue unchecked, and now it was under fire. But just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, the manager took a deep breath, seemingly steeling himself for whatever was to come next. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, there was a sudden sharp voice from behind them. "It's too late for apologies." The words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Everyone turned to look as a new figure entered the scene, an older woman, tall and regal, wearing a uniform that indicated she was part of the airline's senior management. Her presence was commanding, and she moved with a kind of confidence that only came from years of experience. She had clearly seen her fair share of confrontations. The manager stiffened, his expression suddenly a mix of confusion and concern. "Aya, ma'am, I didn't realize you were." "Enough," she cut him off, her voice firm but controlled. "I've been listening, and I think it's clear where this situation has gone wrong." The flight attendant's face went pale. The woman had a reputation. She was known for being fair but uncompromising. The kind of person who didn't tolerate mistakes, especially when they involved mistreating passengers. Tamara took a step forward, her eyes locking with the senior managers. For a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped again. This woman didn't need to say anything more. She already understood. She could feel the weight of Tamara's words and the truth of what had happened. But the question now was, what would she do about it? The flight attendant looked as if he wanted to say something, but the words never came. The senior manager's eyes turned to him, and in that look, Tamara saw everything. The power had shifted again, and this time it was in her favor. The crowd had grown quiet, the air thick with anticipation. Tamara could sense that the end was near, that the resolution was just moments away. But as the senior manager took another step forward, Tamara knew that the final moments of this confrontation would be nothing short of dramatic. The stage was set, and now they were all waiting to see how this would unfold. Would justice be served? Would the arrogant man be forced to reckon with his actions? The answers were close, but not yet, not yet. The tension in the air seemed to crackle with anticipation. Tamara could feel the weight of the crowd's expectant gaze, and she knew that this was the moment. The senior manager had stepped forward, her presence commanding respect, and for a split second, it seemed like this long-standing injustice might finally be addressed. But just as the senior manager was about to speak, a voice from behind them shattered the fragile calm. "Is there a problem here?" The voice was smooth, calm, almost too calm. Tamara turned her head slowly, her heart sinking as she saw the new arrival. A tall man, sharply dressed in a designer suit, was standing at the edge of the scene. He wore an air of arrogance that was impossible to ignore. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, even though they were inside the terminal, and his stance was that of someone who believed he could control any situation with a mere glance. The senior manager paused, clearly caught off guard. The new man, however, seemed to pay him no mind as he strode forward, his eyes scanning the situation like a predator sizing up his prey. There was something off about him, his presence unnervingly smooth, like someone accustomed to getting what they wanted without question. "Sir," the senior manager began hesitantly, "I didn't expect you." Obviously, the man cut him off, his voice laced with a condescending tone. "Let me handle this." The senior manager's face flickered with a mixture of confusion and reluctance. He turned toward Tamara, his lips pressed together in what seemed to be an apology, but he said nothing. Instead, the man in the suit stepped right up to Tamara, his eyes narrowing as he appraised her with an air of superiority. Tamara's instincts flared. She didn't need to ask who this man was. He exuded power, and from the way he was casually dismissing the senior manager's authority, she had a sinking feeling he was someone who didn't belong here in a positive way. He was an outsider, someone who'd been pulled into the situation for reasons she couldn't yet understand. The man adjusted his sunglasses as he came closer, clearly not bothered by the fact that there were dozens of eyes on him. His gaze flicked over Tamara, almost dismissively, before he turned to the flight attendant who had started this entire chain of events. "Is this the woman causing trouble?" he asked, his voice smooth but biting. The flight attendant, clearly intimidated by the new man's arrival, nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. She's been demanding a first-class seat when there were none available." Tamara felt her pulse quicken. Something was off. This man wasn't just some corporate higher-up trying to keep the peace. His actions felt deliberate, calculated. He wasn't here to resolve a simple mistake or to ensure fairness. He was here to control the situation, to turn the narrative in his favor. But why? The crowd had grown restless, and Tamara could sense the shift in the room. The energy had gone from a moment of potential triumph to a simmering uncertainty. What was this man's role? And why did it feel like he was making the situation worse rather than better? "I don't think you understand who you are dealing with," the man said, his voice dripping with disdain as he turned to Tamara, as if addressing an annoyance. "This is a simple misunderstanding. All this drama for what? A seat? You're making this far more difficult than it needs to be." "No," she said, her voice quiet at first, but growing stronger. "This is not a misunderstanding. This is about dignity. About the way people like me are treated every day, like we don't matter. You can call it drama all you want, but I'm done staying silent." The man's smirk widened, as though he hadn't expected this response. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just watched her for a moment, as if savoring the feeling of power he held in his hands. "And you think you're in control here?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "I don't think you understand who I am." Tamara didn't flinch, but in the back of her mind, the question echoed. Who was he? Before she could ask, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black business card, handing it to her with a slow, deliberate motion. She took it reluctantly, glancing at it briefly. The name on the card was familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. There was something unsettling about the way he handed it to her, almost as if it was a marker of something darker. The card was embossed with a logo she didn't recognize, something powerful, something influential. Tamara glanced back up, meeting his gaze. "And what is this supposed to mean?" The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile that said he had the upper hand, and he knew it. "You're right about one thing," he said. "This is no longer about just a seat or a mistake. This is about the people you're dealing with. And if you think you can get away with disrupting the operation of this airline, you're sadly mistaken." The words hit Tamara like a slap. It was a threat, wrapped in an air of politeness, but it was clear. She wasn't just up against a single man's mistake anymore. She was up against something larger. This wasn't an isolated incident. There were forces at play, behind the scenes, that would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Tamara's thoughts raced. She could sense the weight of the situation now. This was no longer just about her being denied a seat or the way she had been disrespected. It was about a system. A system that she had just begun to see the edges of. And as she stood there, holding the card in her hand, she realized something else. This man wasn't just some arrogant businessman. He was part of something much larger, a network of power, influence, and control, and he had just thrown down the gauntlet. The crowd had fallen silent, watching the exchange with growing concern. No one knew what to expect next. Tamara, too, wasn't sure what came next. The stakes had just been raised, and the sense of danger had become tangible. She couldn't back down now. She had made a stand, and that stand had become a beacon. But as the senior manager looked on, caught between his own fear and authority, it was clear. This fight was no longer just hers. The tension was suffocating. Everyone could feel it. The question was no longer whether Tamara would get the seat she was entitled to. The question was whether she would be able to withstand whatever this man and his network would throw at her next. Would she be able to hold her ground in the face of a battle much bigger than she had anticipated? But that was a question for later. Right now, she had to make a choice. A choice that would either change everything or destroy everything. Tamara stood there, the business card in her hand, feeling the weight of it like a physical force. She could hear the whispers of the crowd around her, the hushed voices of people who knew something was about to happen, but none of them could predict what. The man in the suit was still watching her, his smug smile never leaving his face. He thought he had won. He thought he could intimidate her, but she wasn't backing down. Not now. For a moment, she just held the card in her hand, staring at it, as if hoping it would reveal some hidden truth. But it didn't. It only made her feel the full weight of what she was up against. She had spent her life facing down adversity, but this was different. This wasn't just about a seat on an airplane. This was a battle for something deeper, something more systemic. She wasn't just fighting a single man. She was up against an entire network of power that sought to keep people like her in their place. And that, Tamara knew, was something worth fighting for. The senior manager, still standing awkwardly at the edge of the scene, cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice almost a whisper now, "maybe we should." Before he could finish, Tamara cut him off. "No, this ends now." Her voice was steady, unwavering. The crowd, sensing the shift, began to lean in, their focus solely on her. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore, she was standing up for everyone who had ever been silenced. Without taking her eyes off the man in the suit, she stepped forward. "You think you have control here," she said, her tone laced with a quiet fury. "But you're wrong." The man's smile faltered for the first time. It was brief, but it was enough for Tamara to see. He wasn't used to people fighting back. He was used to bending others to his will, and Tamara's refusal to be intimidated was starting to crack the facade of confidence he had so carefully built. He took a step back, his expression hardening. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he warned, his voice lowering. "I can make this all disappear." Tamara didn't flinch. "Go ahead. Try me." Her words were like a challenge, a gauntlet thrown at his feet. For a moment, there was a tense silence. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, the man's smirk returned. He was playing a different game now, one that Tamara didn't fully understand yet. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a sleek phone. Without a word, he pressed a few buttons and held it up to his ear. Tamara watched, her mind racing. Was he calling for backup? Was this going to escalate into something even more dangerous? She felt the eyes of the crowd on her again, but this time it wasn't just the onlookers who were waiting for an answer. It was the man himself, waiting to see how she would respond. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said finally, speaking into the phone with a tone that suggested he wasn't used to saying those words. "We've just had a small misunderstanding." Tamara's heart skipped a beat. What was going on? She could see the flicker of surprise in his eyes as the person on the other end of the call spoke. She couldn't hear the words, but his demeanor shifted. His body language changed from arrogant superiority to something more cautious. He hung up abruptly, slipping the phone back into his pocket. The smirk was gone, replaced by something much more serious. The power he had been so confident in just moments ago seemed to have evaporated. "I don't know who you think you are," he said, his voice now void of its earlier arrogance. "But you don't want to make this harder for yourself." "I already am," Tamara said, her voice steady. She was ready for whatever came next. And then, in a move that shocked everyone, the senior manager stepped forward. "Sir," he said, his voice hesitant, "I need to let you know. This is bigger than just one flight." He turned to Tamara. "We've been instructed to resolve this situation, and we're pulling your records now." Tamara's brow furrowed in confusion, but before she could ask more, the manager continued, "It's already too late. They're watching." And just like that, the true twist revealed itself. The man in the suit, the one who had been so confident moments before, wasn't the real power in this situation at all. He was a puppet, an enforcer for a much larger, far more dangerous organization. one that was operating in the shadows, pulling strings and making people like Tamara disappear, even without the public ever knowing. The senior manager's words hit Tamara like a gut punch. They were already watching, and in that moment, Tamara realized just how deep the conspiracy ran. She wasn't just facing a corrupt system at the airport. She was up against a far-reaching influence that could have its claws in more than just the airline industry. As the pieces began to fall into place, Tamara's mind raced. She was no longer just a passenger trying to secure a seat. She was caught in the crossfire of something much larger. And whoever they weren't going to let her walk away quietly. The man in the suit gave her a look, a small, almost pitying glance. "It's over, sweetheart. You're out of your depth." But Tamara wasn't done. Far from it. She wasn't just going to let them close the door on her. No, this was just the beginning. The final twist hit her like a wave. As she turned to face the crowd, ready to stand her ground, the door to the terminal opened behind her, and another figure stepped through, an unassuming woman, her face partially obscured by dark glasses, but the moment she spoke, everything changed. "Actually, you're wrong," the woman said, her voice calm but authoritative. She moved forward, crossing the terminal with the air of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." Tamara's eyes widened as the woman approached the scene. Her presence was one of quiet power, the kind that made even the man in the suit falter. And when she pulled out a badge, everything clicked into place. She was law enforcement, and Tamara had just been caught up in a much larger operation. "You've been under investigation for quite some time now," the woman continued, looking straight at the man in the suit. "And it's about time someone stopped you." The man's face drained of color, his mask of control shattering in an instant. But there was no escape now. The game had changed, and Tamara was no longer a pawn in their game. The final twist had arrived, one that would turn everything on its head. As the airport buzzed with the realization of what was unfolding, Tamara realized that this battle wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel powerless, everyone who had ever been overlooked. The fight had only just begun, but Tamara was no longer standing alone. The woman with the badge stepped forward with authority, her presence like a sudden shift in the air, heavy and commanding. The man in the suit, who had been so confident moments before, visibly recoiled as the badge glinted under the harsh airport lights. His smirk, once so arrogant, disappeared, replaced by a look of pure panic. He took a step back, his eyes darting around, searching for an escape that no longer existed. Tamara watched, her heart pounding in her chest. The situation had taken a sharp turn, but she couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. She had been right. This wasn't just about a single injustice. It was about a much deeper, far-reaching conspiracy, one that threatened the lives and dignity of so many people. She had unknowingly stepped into a battle she wasn't prepared for, but now, in this moment, she realized she wasn't alone. The woman with the badge turned to Tamara, offering a brief, reassuring smile. "I'm Agent Williams," she said, her voice calm but filled with a quiet strength. "We've been watching this operation for months. You've been a part of something much bigger than you realized, but it's over now." Tamara swallowed hard, her mind trying to catch up with the rapid unfolding of events. "What do you mean? Who is he? What's going on?" Agent Williams nodded toward the man, who was now backing away, his face pale. "This man's not who he claims to be. He's part of a corporate scheme designed to exploit people like you, people who have been marginalized, ignored. He uses his position in the airline to suppress complaints, bury grievances, and maintain a system that keeps certain people from ever having a fair chance." The man in the suit, now visibly sweating, stammered, "You don't know what you're doing. You can't just—" "I can," Agent Williams interrupted firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You've been working for a network that controls much more than just this airline. It's about power, control, and it's time for it to end." Tamara's stomach twisted as the pieces began to click together. This was bigger than she had thought. The injustice she had experienced, The way her complaints had been dismissed and ignored was just a small part of a much larger systemic issue. It wasn't just this one man. It was a system that had been built on inequality and exploitation, one that thrived on keeping certain people, like her, silent. Agent Williams turned back to the man. "I need you to come with me, now." The authority in her voice was undeniable, and the man, realizing there was no escape, nodded reluctantly. He was defeated, but not without a final, scornful glance in Tamara's direction. As he was escorted away by other agents who had quietly surrounded the area, Tamara took a deep breath, still trying to process the surreal turn of events. She had done it. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, had uncovered something that was far bigger than her original fight. But it wasn't just about the victory. It was about the realization that there were forces at play that had far-reaching consequences for countless others. She wasn't just fighting for a seat or respect. She had just exposed a network that had been working against the public for years. The crowd around her slowly began to disperse, some whispering to each other, still in shock from what they had witnessed. The senior manager, who had been standing awkwardly on the sidelines, approached her hesitantly. "Tamara, I had no idea," he said quietly, his voice tinged with guilt. "I didn't know how deep this went." Tamara met his gaze, her expression softening. "None of us did," she said, her voice steady. "But now we know." There was a long pause as the weight of the situation hung in the air. Tamara wasn't interested in pointing fingers. She had seen enough to understand that the system itself was broken, that the true enemy wasn't just one person. It was the system that allowed people like him to thrive. The world wasn't black and white. There were gray areas, complexities, and powers beyond any single person's control. "I don't want to be a part of this," the manager said, his voice low, almost as if confessing. "Not anymore. I want to help. Tell me what I can do." Tamara paused, considering his words. She didn't trust him completely, not yet. But she also knew that everyone had a choice to make, and that it was possible to. "Start by telling the truth," Tamara said. "If you're truly sorry, speak out. Help put an end to this. People need to know what's been happening. And people like you, who are in positions of power, need to stand up too." The manager nodded, the remorse in his eyes genuine. "I will. I swear." Tamara gave him a nod, then turned back to Agent Williams, who was now standing off to the side, observing quietly. The two women exchanged a look, one that conveyed both understanding and shared purpose. Tamara could tell that this wasn't the end of the story. There would be more steps to take, more battles to fight, but she was ready for it. "You'll be safe now," Agent Williams said, breaking the silence. "We'll make sure of it. We've got your back." Tamara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The fear that had gripped her for so long was slowly dissipating. She wasn't just a lone voice anymore. She was part of something much bigger, a movement that sought to expose the truth and demand accountability. The injustice she had suffered was just one chapter in a much larger story, and now she had the power to change the narrative. As Tamara walked toward the exit, Agent Williams at her side, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be obstacles, challenges, and perhaps even dangers. But for the first time in a long time, Tamara felt like she was on the right side of history. And as she stepped into the sunlight, a thought crossed her mind. This was only the beginning. The fight for justice, for fairness, for equality, it wasn't over. In fact, it was just getting started. And she would be there every step of the way, no longer silent, no longer overlooked. The truth would be heard. The fight would continue. And together, they would make sure that no one else would ever have to suffer in silence again. As the scene at the airport slowly faded behind her, Tamara knew one thing for sure. Her life had changed. But the world, it was about to change too, and she was ready to be a part of that change.